We serial killers are your sons. We are your husbands. We are everywhere. And there will be more of your children dead tomorrow. On January 4th, 1974, a man named Ted Bundy broke into 18-year-old Karen Sparks' apartment. While Karen Sparks was sleeping, Bundy beat her with a metal rod and sexually assaulted her. While she survived the attack, she suffered from severe disabilities after the incident and was in a coma for 10 days. Ted Bundy, on the other hand, had only begun his horrifying murder spree. Ted Bundy, one of the most terrifying serial killers in U.S. history, he's known for his severe hatred towards women. However, when people first took a glance at him, Ted Bundy didn't look like someone who was capable of doing the atrocities he had committed. In this episode of The Most Dangerous Animal of All, we take a look into Ted Bundy's life, the horrifying necrophiliac. Ted Bundy was born Theodore Robert Cowell on November 24, 1946. He was born at Elizabeth Lund's home for unwed mothers in Burlington, Vermont. The identity of Bundy's biological father remains unknown. It's important to note that in the 1950s, being an unwed mother was scandalous, and illegitimate children were often teased and treated as outcasts. Due to this, Ted Bundy's grandparents, Samuel and Eleanor Cowell, took on the role of being Ted's parents. Because of this, Bundy grew up believing that his mother Louise was actually his sister, and that his grandparents were his parents. While at first the Cowells looked like quite a normal family, the relatives of the family explained that the Cowell home was extremely violent. Ted Bundy's grandmother suffered from depression and agoraphobia, while Ted Bundy's grandfather had been described as the owner of a raging temper and a bigot. His grandfather would go on long rants, and especially loud rants, about how much he disliked minorities and religious groups. He would also physically abuse Bundy's grandmother and his children, as well as the family dog. There were those who theorized that Bundy was actually a product of his grandfather raping his mother, Louise. Additionally, it was said that his grandfather suffered from hallucinations and would argue with people who were not present. His grandmother, Eleanor, was supposedly terrified of his grandfather, and she would receive electric shock therapy. While Bundy himself insisted that he had a good relationship with his grandfather, his relatives stated that his grandfather was both physically and psychologically abusive towards Louise, Eleanor, and Bundy himself. His mother, Louise, eventually decided it would be best for her and Bundy to move to Washington to live with her cousin. At the time, Bundy was only 3 years old. Louise changed her last name from Cowell to Nelson to hide the fact that Ted Bundy was illegitimate. Bundy's aunt began to notice strange behavior from him. She told Vanity Fair in an interview about how she would wake up to her toddler nephew placing knives next to her sleeping form. When Bundy's aunt went and told other relatives, they didn't think much about it. The moving process itself was hard on Bundy, and he often missed Philadelphia. The situation only became worse for him when his mother met ex-military cook Johnny Bundy. In 1951, they got married, and Johnny legally adopted Ted. Jealous of his mother's new relationship, Bundy would have public tantrums, wetting his pants as a part of the display. Ted's behavior began to change, and unlike other children who seemed to thrive on parental attention and affection, Bundy preferred isolation and disconnection from family and friends. Relations between Bundy and his stepfather were always tense. This was because Bundy was very materialistic and wanted expensive clothing and belongings. However, his working-class stepfather could not provide this. Sometimes, Bundy's stepfather would get so frustrated due to Bundy constantly provoking him, and he would strike Bundy out in frustration. As time went on, Louise and Johnny had 4 more children. Ted had to adjust to not being an only child anymore. The Bundy home was small, cramped, and tense. Money was scarce, and Louise was left taking care of the children without any additional help. Despite the circumstances at home, Bundy grew into an attractive teenager who got along with his peers and performed well in school. He had a few good friends and took jobs like delivering newspapers and cutting lawns. He would go to church with his parents, and notably, for a future killer, he saved the life of a friend's niece when she was at the risk of drowning. However, at this age, Bundy began to show violent tendencies, and he began to break the law. A fellow Boy Scout remembered Bundy once coming from behind to hit him over the head with a stick. Bundy would also enjoy stories that were gore-filled and filled with rape and murder. Eventually, Bundy began to break the law. He would break into cars and homes. The main motive behind this was to go downhill skiing because it was the only sport he was good at, but it was expensive. He needed the money in order to go downhill skiing, and the only way to do this in his mind was by stealing. His habits only grew worse when he was labeled a peeping Tom. He was labeled a peeping Tom because he would spy on strangers. After high school, Bundy went to university. While he scored academically, he failed socially. This was because Bundy continued to suffer from acute shyness, which eventually resulted in social awkwardness. He did manage to develop some friendships, but he was never comfortable with participating in most social activities. He rarely dated and mostly kept to himself. This all began to feed into the inferiority complex that Bundy was building, and he ended up transferring to the University of Washington in his sophomore year. Ted eventually managed to grow a bit socially, and he met his first love. However, she was pretty, wealthy, and sophisticated, and Ted would constantly try to impress her. He eventually dropped out of college as he felt working, attending college, and having a girlfriend was all too much. He would work multiple minimum wage jobs in order to impress his girlfriend, but she wasn't happy. Unimpressed with Bundy's lack of ambition, his girlfriend decided that he was not husband material, and she ended the relationship and moved back to her parents' home in California. This completely shattered Bundy, and he would continue to obsess over her for years. He entered a deep depression and traveled to Colorado, Arkansas, and Philadelphia. He eventually enrolled at Temple University and returned to Washington in the fall of 1969. However, before his return to Washington, it is believed he learned the truth about his mother. It is unknown how Bundy handled this information, but after this event, he completely changed. The once introverted and shy Ted Bundy had changed into an outgoing and confident man. He returned to the University of Washington and finished his degree in psychology. Life began to get better for Bundy, and the more confident Bundy had several women swooning over him, including his first love. At this point, Ted Bundy's confidence had already led him to commit atrocities. On January 4th, 1974, he committed his first crime. He broke into 18-year-old Karen Sparks' apartment. He beat her with a metal rod before sexually assaulting her. While Karen survived the attack, she was in a coma for 10 days after the attack. She's suffered ever since. Only a month after this, Bundy kidnapped Linda Ann Healy. He strangled her to death. In the next year, he murdered 9 other females. These included Donna Gail Manson, Suzanne Rancourt, Roberta Parks, Brenda Carol Ball, Janice Ann Oth, Dennis Naslund, Nancy Wilcox, Melissa Smith, and Deborah Jean Kent. These killings all happened in 1974, with only a month between each killing. Bundy would lure these women in by using horrible tricks. In November 1974, he would attempt to abduct Carol D'Orange by pretending to be a police officer. She managed to escape him. Pretending to be a police officer wasn't Bundy's only trick. He would also use his newfound charm to pick up women. Sometimes he even used a fake cast on his arm, and he would ask them for help. On January 12, 1975, Karen Campbell vanished from a ski resort in Colorado while on vacation with her fiancé and 2 children. A month later, Karen's nude body was found lying a short distance from the road. However, Bundy's killings in Colorado did not stop with Karen, and over the next few months, 5 more women were found with similar violent blows to the head. He kidnapped and killed Julie Cunningham, Denise Oliverson, Lynette Culver, and Suzanne Curtis. Notably, the women that he had kidnapped, raped, and killed were remarkably similar to one another. Most of them would have long dark hair that was parted in the middle. Ted Bundy resented his mother for several reasons: being illegitimate, making him move away, marrying his stepfather, and not giving him enough attention. Ted Bundy's victims mostly resembled his mother, and he resented them for that, and killed them in the worst way possible. However, his killing spree would be put on a halt when Bundy was arrested for the first time. In August 1975, the police attempted to stop Bundy for a driving violation. He rose suspicion when he tried to get away by turning his car lights off and speed through the stop signs. When he was finally stopped, his car was searched, and his police found suspicious items including handcuffs, an ice pick, a crowbar, and a pantyhose with the eye holes cut out. The police then arrested Ted Bundy on suspicion of burglary. The police compared the things found in Bundy's cars to those Darange described seeing in her attacker's car. They were able to conclude that the handcuffs that had been placed on one of her wrists were the same as the one in Bundy's possession. Once Darange picked Bundy out of a lineup, the police felt they had enough evidence to charge him with attempted kidnapping. In February of 1976, Bundy went to trial for the attempted kidnapping of Darange. He was found guilty and sentenced to 15 years in prison. During this time, the police were linking Bundy to the Colorado murders, and Bundy was charged with the murder of Karen Campbell. He served as his own lawyer in this case, but during the pre-trial hearing, escaped by jumping out of the law library window. He was caught a week later and put back into his jail cell. However, on the 30th of December 1977, Bundy escaped once again. This time, he broke into Florida State University. He entered the Chi Omega sorority house and strangled Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy to death. He then beat Karen Ann Chandler and Katie Kleiner while they slept. He also attacked Cheryl Thomas. A month after this, he kidnapped and raped a 12-year-old named Kimberly Leach. Her body was later found near the Suwannee River State Park. He was eventually caught again by the police when an officer noticed him driving quickly. The officer ran his plates and realized that Bundy had stolen a car. He was once again arrested. He went to trial in Florida on June 25, 1979, for the murders of the sorority women. He would be found guilty on both murder charges and given 2 death sentences by means of the electric chair. On January 7, 1980, Bundy went on trial for killing Kimberly Leach. This time, Bundy had proper attorneys representing him. Bundy was found guilty and received a 3rd death sentence. On January 24, 1989, Ted Bundy was executed at Ryford Prison in Stark, Florida. Bundy himself claimed that the reason behind his atrocities lay in the exposure to alcohol and violent pornography. Before his execution, Bundy confessed to the murders of more than 24 women, but sadly, no one will ever know exactly how many crimes Bundy really committed and how many innocent lives he actually took. When looking at Ted Bundy, there is a serial killer with clear motives behind his killings. He resented women, and he enjoyed necrophilia. He got psychological gratification from killing women specifically and then raping them. He enjoyed feeling that he was in power because for so much of his life, he felt worthless. While Bundy's childhood was traumatic, Bundy himself believed it wasn't the biggest playing factor in his evil actions. Bundy believed that the violent pornography, exposure to alcohol, and detective fiction stories with gore-filled depictions of rape and murder were all things that played a role. These were things that he was exposed to as a child. He would turn to these things when he felt there was nothing else for him in his life. Additionally, Ted Bundy is a serial killer with extremely clear patterns and connections to his childhood. His killings were all gruesome, and they showcased his hatred towards women and love for rape and necrophilia, things he was exposed to as a child. Weirdly enough, Ted Bundy was a serial killer that several women of the time found extremely attractive, and his court trial had rooms filled with women. For a man that was as narcissistic as Bundy was, this only boosted his ego. After a shattering experience with first love, a tense relationship with family and friends, as well as a growing lust for rape and necrophilia, Ted Bundy was an explosion waiting to happen. When he finally blew, he never settled again. And that is one of the main reasons he got caught. He couldn't stop killing. His lust for that psychological gratification he got from killing women and raping them would lead to his downfall, not once, not twice, but thrice. To conclude, Ted Bundy is one of the serial killers that have left a deep scar on several states of the United States, as well as the women of these states. He, along with several other serial killers we've covered in this series, were seen as the embodiment of evil, with no remorse for his horrendous actions.